This evening on the Rock Newman Show, we focus on the motherland, Mother Africa. What are the issues impacting 21st century Africa and the major players involved in a rapidly changing social and political landscape? Joining me is Obi Egbuna Jr., an activist, journalist, and expert on all things Africa. That's coming up right now on the Rock Newman Show. Welcome to the Rock Newman Show from the campus of historic Howard University right here in the nation's capital. I'm Rock Newman, and it is my desire to inspire you with personal stories of extraordinary achievement. The face of Africa is ever-changing. We've gone from colonialism to post-colonialism to an Africa rapidly evolving for the 21st century. What are the issues impacting Africa today? Who are the major players involved in Africa's dynamic and ever-changing social and political landscape? My guest tonight, Obi Egbuna Jr., has answers and insights. Obi is an African journalist and activist. Thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Thank
Welcome
you.
to the Rock Newman Show.
Thank you.
All right. You know, so much to talk about, all things Africa.
Yes.
Before we get into that, you are the proud papa of
Yes,
a
sir.
2-month-old named Mosiah.
Yes.
Why did you name him Mosiah?
Oh, in honor of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, without question.
So he's at the very dawn of his life. There is someone who I know that you have covered closely for many, many years, Robert Mugabe.
Yes.
I remember Robert Mugabe shortly after Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. He came to Howard University in 1980 and gave an electrifying speech. And perhaps the biggest applause during that speech was when he said, "I welcome you, come home." How is he now?
He's no longer in government. He's played his role, and all the support that was thrown behind him, we hope that people are willing to throw behind the current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, because what's very important, of paramount importance, is we never make a distinction between the fighters and their organizations. For too long, we separate fighters from their organizations. We separate Dr. King from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We separate the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan from the Nation of Islam. We separate Malcolm X from the Nation of Islam, Organization of African Unity, Muslim Mosque Incorporated. We separate Kwame Ture from the All-African
Mandela
from the African National Congress. So I think that understanding that defending Zimbabwe's integrity, defending Zimbabwe's sovereignty is the ultimate goal, and also remembering that the United States and European Union, US-EU imperialism's goal is to bring about regime change. So they did not just want former President Mugabe gone, they want the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front gone because of what they represent in the scheme of Southern Africa being the most stable region in Africa at this particular historical juncture.
Please do me a favor and the viewing audience a favor and explain why it is that it is in the interest, or why you believe that the U.S. government and its allies wanted that kind of, not just regime change, but also to severely diminish the organization.
Well, there are many different dimensions to the conversation. Number one, there's a military aspect of it, there's an agricultural aspect of it, and there's a political aspect of it. First of all, let's do the military. When you take a look at the fact that the Obama administration, on the heels of the Bush administration, introduced U.S. Africa Military Command, which is an initiative set up to intensify their military presence on the African continent. And you look at that throughout the African continent. But interestingly enough, the main satellite is in Stuttgart, Germany. But on the continent of Africa, in Djibouti, in East Africa, which we geographically call the Horn of Africa, that's where the main satellite is. But when you look at it from the vantage point that when we were babies in struggle, shutting down the United States over the Rodney King verdict and police terrorism inside the borders of this country, and letting it be emphatically known that our struggle against police terrorism in this country is inextricably linked to the struggle to end military repression and violence everywhere in the world. And while we were fighting over the Rodney King question, you saw Babangida and Abacha in Nigeria being shown the door. You saw Mengistu in Ethiopia shown the door. You saw Samuel Doe in Liberia shown the door. Moussa Traoré, who 50 years ago overthrew Modibo Keïta in Mali, shown the door. You saw Renamo, the CIA installation in Mozambique, destabilized. You saw UNITA, the CIA mercenary unit in Angola, destabilized. So the African continent made an emphatic statement that we no longer wanted military neocolonialism. So now the U.S. Africa Command, and Zimbabwe is one of the main countries that is opposed to that initiative. And the biggest threat to an all-out imperialist military presence in Africa are Zimbabwe's military, Namibia's military, Angola's military, Mozambique's military, and Eritrea in East Africa's military. Those are our 5 best fighting forces. And it rejects the narrative that we are militarily uncivilized. And however, though, contextually, we have had some great fighters who have a military background. That great son of Africa, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, is military. Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt has a military background. Samora Machel, military background. But even though they had a military background, they did not govern their country using the military as the anchor to carry out policy, impose policy, enforce policy. That just happened to be their background. So we've had Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, military background. So we've had revolutionaries of the highest order who have had a military background, but the question is not letting your former colonizers and captors dictate your direction militarily. And if you look at the propaganda assault on Zimbabwe, when you look at the congressional hearings, whether they come from the Senate, the Foreign Relations Committee, you can go back and look at them. Your listeners can go to www.thomas.gov if they dare. The Congressional International Relations Committee, their focus was always Zimbabwe must restructure their military. And the fact that President Mnangagwa, who was by former President Mugabe's side for 50 years, comes from that background, has a military background, legal background, and intelligence background, it threatens them. And remember, 18 years ago, 19 years ago, before the land reclamation program, former President Mugabe oversaw the Southern African Defense Forces for the whole region. And they made a decision that Zimbabwe's military, Angola's military, and Namibia's military would fight off former U.S. ambassador to the UN and former National Security Advisor's Susan Rice's pet project to reinvade the Congo after Mobutu, the godfather of military neocolonialism, showed the door. So there's antagonism towards Zimbabwe on the military front. On the agricultural front, 67%, Mr. Newman, of the workforce in Southern Africa, a region of 14 nations, 67% of the workforce, their work is tied to agriculture. And the fact that land reclamation in Southern Africa has taken the same trajectory that the independence struggle did. In order, Mozambique got its independence, Angola got its independence, Zimbabwe got its independence, so we're saying 74, 75, 80, Namibia, and 90.
You know what, you're doing something as you talk about the various names of the countries on the continent of Africa. Because too many people say Africa and think that's it.
Yes.
And there are 54 countries in Africa.
Yes.
You teach at the Sankofa homeschool community.
There, amongst many other places.
Yes. And part of what comes out of that teaching is your identifying the uniqueness of Africa.
Yes.
And you brought a young lady with you. Her name is Onia Gross.
Yes.
She's 12 years old.
Just
and
turned
for
12.
anybody watching this show that might not understand there are 54 countries in Africa, we're going to have her to name them for you. So Jimmy, just to pause here, and we're going to take a look at Miss Gross do her thing.
I've been taught to use letters and numbers to name my African countries. A2, B4, C7, D2, E4, G5, K1, L3, M7, N3, R1, S10, T3, U1, Z2, Algeria, Angola, Benin, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cameroon, Cape Verde, Central African Republic, Chad, Comoros Islands, Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Djibouti, DRC, Egypt, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Gabon, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, Lesotho, Liberia, Libya, Madagascar, Malawi, Mali, Mauritania, Mauritius, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia, Niger, Nigeria, Rwanda, Saharan Arab Democratic Republic, Sao Tome and Principe, Senegal, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, Somalia, South Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, Swaziland, Tanzania, Togo, Tunisia, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe.
That could not be more impressive, man. just and the children shall lead us.
Yes, without question.
What is the tell us tell before we go back to the All Things Africa?
Yeah.
Tell us about the mission of the school, which is right here in our area.
Well, it's part of a campaign that we've developed, and it's called the Pan-African Roving Classroom. So I've had the pleasure of teaching for nearly 30 years now. And we started our training by the late Kamal Robinson at Roots Activity Learning Center in Roots Public Charter School. Shout out to our sister and comrade, Dr. Benita Thompson, the director of Roots. And so we started there. So in the last 5 years, I've had the honor of teaching at Sankofa Homeschool Community, which is a community of people who understand what's going on right now, that 8,000 students drop out every day in the United States of America, and so-called African Americans have the distinction of, if you want to call it that, of being 850 of that 8,000, which is 350,000 students a year. So we understand what's coming down the pipe, so we want to have some alternatives in place. So we are tied to the Liberated Minds Homeschool Expo in Atlanta, Georgia, the Black Star Homeschool Academy in Birmingham, Alabama. We have ties to some folks in Antigua, in London, so it's a growing movement. But I also teach at Muhammad University of Islam. I've also taught at Ujuma Shule. I've also taught at the Academy for Ideal Education. I've also taught at Ideal Public Charter School here in the district. Twice a year, if schedule permits, but at least once a year, we go to Alabama, where we go into Marion, to Lowndes County, to Montgomery, and now to Birmingham. Primarily in Marion, that's historically significant because at one time, the infamous Lincoln Normal University, HBCU, had the distinction of having more PhDs per capita than any other HBCU in the country. And at one point, instructors from Tuskegee, from Miles, from Alabama A&M and Alabama State would convene at Lincoln Normal every summer. But now we go to Hatch High School, we go to Uniontown Elementary, we go to Francis Marion Junior High and High School. So we technically deal with private school young people, homeschool young people, public school homes people. And what she demonstrated we developed a formula to teach the African nations. So she did letters, numbers, so there are 2 with the letter A, 4 with the letter B, 7. So we've been doing that for a little while, and the youngest child to learn that was 6 years old.
That's amazing. You know, we recently did a show right here where we talked about Afro-Latino relations.
Yes.
And each of the panelists really illuminated some of the critical issues affecting the diaspora and the problems. And it seemed as if much of the root of the issue was the brainwashing,
Of course.
was the propaganda, which made, whether it was Brazil or Honduras or so many other places, that individuals felt as if they did not want to have an attachment to what were their roots of Africa.
Yes.
And this education that you're providing really seems that if a kid is grounded in this kind of knowledge and connection, that perhaps they're the ones that could go out and change this world, because there's a lot that needed to be changed throughout the diaspora.
Of course. And our approach is we don't teach history to our children, we teach history through our children. Because when we do it that way, eventually what ends up happening is we're usually at the schools once a week that we have the privilege of going to. And then what ends up happening is the parents are looking for us all the time. And then it piques their curiosity. And it is from that vehicle that we've been able to funnel the kids into Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, where we use theater as a vehicle to teach history. And as you eloquently put it, it's so simple. This is the decolonization process, which is never going to stop. We just want to make sure that we're forward thinking to ensure victory in the decolonization process.
And I recently read something, certainly one of the giants to come out of the halls of Howard University, Stokely Carmichael at the time, Kwame Ture. There is an initiative underfoot that involves and invokes his memory. Can you share what that is?
His son, Buka Ture, has creating, this year is the 20th anniversary of Kwame passing, actually next week, November 15th. He succumbed from prostate cancer at the tender age of 57 in Conakry, Guinea, where he was the head advisor of the Democratic Party of Guinea. Most people, when they speak of him in the context of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, understandably so. Some may speak of him as one of the founders of the first Black Panther Party in Lowndes County. Some may speak of him in relationship to the third Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, when he was the honorary prime minister, responsible for 45 chapters in a year and a half. Some glowingly got to know him during his time with the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, as this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare by Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, which Kwame bragged he got to see in manuscript form. And that is where we first heard of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. And so people know about him, but people forget that Kwame became the head advisor of the Democratic Party of Guinea, founded by Ahmed Sékou Touré, which is the first political party created during the anti-colonial resistance in Africa. We had unions, we had fronts, we had movements, but the standout parties, you had the Democratic Party of Guinea in 1946. When Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah got back to Ghana, he comes with the Convention People's Party, 49. Around 56, we have the Party for Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde with Amilcar Cabral. And then you have in Zambia, you have the United National Independent Party. And Fela Kuti's mother had the People's Communist Party in Nigeria. And the reason that's important, and we've been saying, nudging, pressuring with love, our sisters and brothers that make up our civil and human rights fraternity, Pan-Africanize your voting education initiatives. And what we mean by that is when we come to talk about parties, we should be talking about the parties we created in Africa. We should be talking about the first party in the hemisphere in 1908, Partido Independiente de Colo, created in Cuba. So we're going to talk about alternatives to the two-headed monster, the Democratic and Republican Party, and we're not going to talk about the parties that come out of our resistance, that have the ingredients of self-determination and national liberation. We're doing the children a disservice. So just that, but yes, the initiative to introduce an exhibit that commemorates the work, contributions, the service, and sacrifice of Kwame Ture. It is scheduled to be launched in Conakry, Guinea, where he is buried next to Ahmed Sekou Touré and Mbalia Kamara. But the first showing of the exhibit will be sometime in February at Howard University, and we thank you for your support with this initiative.
Well, thank you. Obviously, you know, it is. I think the initiative is extraordinarily noble. Let me ask you, because man, there is something in the political philosophy, political, social, economic philosophy rooted in Kwame Ture.
Yes.
As he answered the phone, kind of almost on his dying bed, was still ready for the revolution. And he was a...
Which comes from the Democratic Party of Guinea. Many people don't know that.
Yes.
Yeah, most definitely.
And so Pan-Africanism was in his DNA until his last day.
Yes.
Which, if you understand the definition of Pan-Africanism, it is something that is so fundamentally sound that you connect throughout the diaspora.
Yes.
And you support and you build. Why is it not more sustained and more prevalent?
That's an excellent question. I think what it is it could come down to approach. If I could have a departure, because you got to speaking about Spanish-speaking Africans, so you have me over here. There's a quick poem we have. Can I do it?
Yes.
Okay, and this is called the language poem, and this deals with this whole question of Africans in the Americas, for those of us who firmly believe that the first form of public transportation was the slave ships. So this is the language poem. Africans here in the U.S. are English-speaking Africans. Africans in Trinidad are English-speaking Africans. Africans in Jamaica are English-speaking Africans. Just like Africans who live in Ghana, just like Africans who live in Kenya, just like Africans who live in Zimbabwe. English-speaking Africans are still Africans, no doubt about it. Africans in Haiti are French-speaking Africans. Africans in Martinique are French-speaking Africans. Just like Africans who live in Guinea, just like Africans who live in Algeria, just like Africans who live in the Congo. French-speaking Africans are still Africans, no doubt about it. Africans in Cuba are Spanish-speaking Africans. Africans in Colombia are Spanish-speaking Africans. Africans in Venezuela are Spanish-speaking Africans. Just like Africans who live in Equatorial Guinea, Spanish-speaking Africans are still Africans, no doubt about it. Africans in Brazil are Portuguese-speaking Africans. Just like Africans who live in Angola, just like Africans who live in Mozambique, just like Africans who live in Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese-speaking Africans are still Africans, no doubt about it. We're all Africans, we're all Africans, we're all Africans. Learn to explain it, learn to celebrate it, learn to defend it. So that's one of the poems we came up with for children to deal with that dynamic you spoke of earlier.
And part of what we dealt with, again, was the profound effort in these various countries to distance themselves. And again, you know, colonialism, the propaganda machine, and the rest. That show illuminated what has been the effectiveness of white supremacy.
Of course. And I'm glad you brought that up, because let's just do it this way. First of all, as Kwame Ture trained us and taught us, as Mukasa Dada trained us and taught us, Pan-Africanism is not an ideology, it's an objective. And the reason that we say that is because they are things that can be dangerous, that are counter-revolutionary, that reek of neo-colonialism, but have a Pan-African makeup and character to it. We'll give some examples. Those who know the history of UNITA in Angola, the CIA created mercenary unit, vicious, ruthless as it was, their leader was a man named Jonas Savimbi. He had to hide outside of Angola. When he finally came back into Angola, he came in on the private jet of Hufvud-Boigny, arguably the worst worst neo-colonialist leader we've ever seen in Africa. And Nkrumah's coup was planned in his living room. Amilcar Cabral's assassination planned in his living room. Thomas Sankar's assassination planned in his living room. And so that's Pan-African. Here's a president of Cote d'Ivoire flying in a mercenary from Angola. That's Pan-African. If a dope dealer in Baltimore hooks up with a dope dealer in Nigeria, that's Pan-Africanism. Nothing we would promote. Well, you mentioned Zimbabwe earlier. A few months ago, they had their elections, and ZANU-PF had a resounding victory once again, this time inviting the International Republican Institute, overseen by late Senator John McCain, still alive at the time, inviting the National Democratic Institute, overseen by Madeleine Albright, that come out of an initiative in 1983 after Reagan spoke to European Parliament about the need for them to have think tanks to ensure victory in the Cold War. And the observers that were chosen of African makeup, you had Johnny Carson, the former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs under the first Obama administration, U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe under the second Clinton administration. He's part of the delegation. Karen Bass, the highest ranking African on the Congress of International Relations Committee, was on the delegation. Connie Berry Newman, who was Assistant Secretary for African Affairs to George Bush the father, was part of the delegation. And the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was part of the delegation, and the former interim president of the Central African Republic, Catherine Samba Panza, was part of the delegation. That delegation is Pan-African in makeup. Certainly nothing we would promote. As a matter of fact, the makeup of that delegation is to make sure that those of us who defend what we defend are buried 6 feet under. So all manifestations, all expressions of Pan-Africanism are not revolutionary, are not committed to self-determination. As a matter of fact, some are created to compromise everything that we have shed our blood for.
Okay, let me, let's talk about some, you mentioned earlier, land reclamation.
Yes.
That has been in the news.
Yes, it has.
Big time. Land reclamation and the ramifications of it in South Africa and Namibia. So first, I'm going to ask you to frame the argument that is propagandized, and then tell us what's really happening in those countries on the ground.
Oh, it's the inevitable. I mean, if you want to use South Africa, as this is the 100th birthday anniversary this numerical year of the Madiba Nelson Mandela, all due respect to him, all due respect to the African National Congress, the first liberation movement in Africa, created in 1912, 3 years after the NAACP. Nothing but the ultimate respect for them. As a matter of fact, everyone knows that after they studied Montgomery and its effects, Montgomery Improvement Association, they had a bus boycott themselves. So they've always followed the civil and human rights template inside the borders of the United States. But Mandela
and if I can say this, as did the South African government follow the example
there you go.
of the United States government in its repression.
Well said.
And oppression.
Well said. And so I say that to say that the African National Congress and Madiba Nelson Mandela in particular, that he avoided the question of land like Dr. King avoided violence. Avoided it in Monroe, North Carolina with Robert Williams, avoided it with the Deacons of Defense for Louisiana. He thought it was a principle. So the fact that, so if we happen, and a lot of people overlooked it, I'd always teasingly joke with a mutual friend of ours, Jonathan Hutto, that what many people call the anti-apartheid movement in this country was really African National Support Congress support work, which was necessary. But there were many who crossed the street when it was time to help the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania and the Azanian People's Organization / Black Consciousness Movement created by Steve Biko. And the reason I say that, it is those organizations that raise the question of land. If you look at the African National Congress, anywhere they speak, they say Amandla Nwetu, freedom now in their language. Or Nkosi Sikeleli, God bless Africa. It is the PAC that says Izwe Letu I Africa, which means the land is ours. So Mangalizo Sobukwe, who was the African National Congress Youth League leader, who organized the Sharpeville Massacre, Kwalanga Massacre, March 21st, 1960, against the PASAC laws, considered the most dangerous organizer in South Africa by the apartheid regime. His wife died 2.5 months ago, Mama Veronica Sobukwe, at 91 years old. And if you compare the recognition and the homage we paid to her to the homage we paid to Mama Winnie Mandela when she passed, it was disrespectful. It was unacceptable. So our hope is that the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania uses the death of her, because you saw an incident at the funeral of Mama Sobukwe. The government, the African National Congress, they tried to come to the funeral and put the South African flag over her grave.
Yeah.
The PAC said, we want our flag to go over her grave. So you could see on the left-hand side 2 things. Number 1, Izwe Letu E Africa. And not only that, if you study the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania symbol, the star is placed at Ghana in acknowledgement of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party. So that has to be highlighted. So what our concern is they are people, key individuals, visible, who are exploiting the mileage of that the question of land generates, which represents the legitimate aspirations of the people, and are not the least bit concerned about the land, but are part of this dynamic in our community right now where they are more interested in building their reputations at the expense of our movement than building our movement. And sometimes we mistaken visibility with commitment. So the harder I bang on the podium, the louder my voice is, I automatically represent something legitimate, something militant. Not at all. It's a masquerade. And I'm not even gonna mention any names today, I'm in a good mood. But what I'm saying is, what we want to see is the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania and the ZAPO work out their internal challenges, which stem from the fact that they were in exile for such a long time, and we want them to lead that struggle for the issue of land.
Obi, for the uninformed, what I'd really like for you to do is, in the most fundamental way, deal with this issue of land, because the imagery is black savages are taking away the land that belongs to white farmers, and we can't let them have it because they don't know how to farm it anyhow.
I'll do one better than that. 17 years ago, I'm working at Bowie State University. I'm not smart enough to teach college. I was working in dorms. And professor comes up to me, Fred Mills, Caucasian, progressive, does a lot of work around El Salvador, does a lot of work around Cuba, Nicaragua. That's his focus. So he sees me in the hallway, and at that time, we had gotten Bowie State University to commit to become the first HBCU to develop a cultural exchange program with Cuba. Because once they read the Chronicle of Higher Education and saw Duke was going to do it, Tulane was going to do it, Berkeley was going to do it, Harvard was going to do it, it was fine with them. But anyway, getting back to the point, so he sees me in the hallway, he runs me down, he's like, Brother Egbuna. I said, yeah, what can I do for you? He says, what do you think about the land seizure in Zimbabwe? Every question you answer is based on orientation and outlook, correct?
You're right.
So I said, what makes you bring up Cecil Rhodes and the British South African Company? What makes you bring up Jeffrey Huggins? What makes you bring up Ian Smith? Oh, I wasn't talking about them. I said, what you talking about then? He said, no, I was talking about the government taking, I said, you used the word seized. How can former President Mugabe and ZANU-PF seize Zimbabwean land from British and Rhodesian byproducts who were there because of what the British South African Company did with their fascist slogan from Cape to Cairo, meaning they wanted every grain and every inch of Africa. Palestinians can't seize Palestine. Our Native American sisters and brothers can't seize La Plato. The Chippewa Nation from the Democrats and Republicans is theirs. Evo Morales in Bolivia did not seize Bolivia, he reclaimed it. The Irish, as the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey told us, Africa for the Africans, Ireland from the Irish, they're not seizing Belfast, they're seeking to reclaim it. All indigenous people are obligated by history to reclaim what is inherently theirs. So any conversation about that is obviously to divert attention from the question of land. And ironically, we shouldn't be surprised that this is going to happen with what is called South Africa, because we're 17 years removed from the United Nations Conference on Racism, Xenophobia, and Other Related Intolerances, where the Bush administration had many sleepless nights because they didn't want chattel slavery, our captivity, reparations, and Palestine to be conversations. And ironically, that's the same numerical year that they introduced the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which was sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe for reclaiming 70% of the country's most agriculturally resourceful land from 4,500 commercial farmers of European, British, Rhodesian ancestry. So we reclaim what is ours, never seizure. The only question is, when we reclaim it, will we do right by the people and make sure that they're the beneficiaries of it?
Okay, so right now there is an emerging Chinese presence in Africa. When I was in Libya, I saw it. Proliferation of buildings. So it's the Chinese impact is spreading. So with the indigenous people, China pouring in money. What's China's objective?
Okay.
And what's going to be the defense against China doing what imperialists have done before?
Well, of course, the thing that's interesting about that, and I won't, like I said, we're not naming names today, but of course, you know, we get this question all the time. But interestingly enough, those who have gone on record using newspapers at their disposal, shows like this at their disposal, whatever platform they have at their disposal that have raised the question of the Chinese presence in Africa, interestingly enough, if you go back and look at them based on their organizational track record as individuals, let's assume they're even organizing, because you know many people don't even organize no more, Mr. Newman, but that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But many of them have never talked about the African Growth and Opportunity Act of the Clinton administration. Many of them have never talked about the corporate council.
Okay, stop there.
Okay.
Stop there. What's the name of it?
The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA.
And I think that you bring that up as in you got some issues with it.
Of course.
And what are those issues?
Because as our sisters, you know, and other women spent last year and this year focusing on Harvey Weinstein, for example, we say don't forget Harvey Firestone. Because if Mother Africa could cry Me Too and talk about rape and talk about plunder, obviously what Firestone has done, obviously what all of the businesses that are part of the Council of Foreign Relations have done, obviously what the Anglo-American Corporation has done, obviously what De Beers has done, obviously what Shell has done, Africa could scream rape at the top of her lungs. We got a poem about that one. We won't do it right now though, called Don't Touch, Don't Touch. So that whole question. So when we talk about the African Growth and Opportunity Act, let's just take it back to Nkrumah. Nkrumah talks about when he came here in 1960, as we know, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, his passport was seized by the United States government at the tender age of 83 from 1953 to 1961. So obviously who knew Nkrumah better than King, who went to Ghana's independence celebration, better than Ralph Bunche, who went there, better than John Johnson, who went there. He couldn't even go. He would have led the delegation. Right. So he bumps into him and Nkrumah. They see each other while they're here. And Nkrumah tells him, yeah, I came here to talk about the dam we were building, the Akasambo, the first hydroelectrical dam built in modern African history. He said, but the moment I touch down here, the Hershey people want to see me about the cocoa in Ghana. We, those who remember the Lancaster House negotiations in Zimbabwe, remember that Jesse Helms went to London, intercepted Bishop Abel Muzorewa, the reactionary religious leader, if you want to call him that. They bring him back here to DC, put him in a room with R.J. Reynolds' leadership, the tobacco company, put him in the room with Philip Morris. And they say, if you give us control of the agriculture industry, we'll push you in front of Mugabe and Nkomo. This is fact. So we already know that people who are talking about China, the mistake that people are making is they're starting the relationship between China and Africa on the business context. China built the railroads for Tanzania under the leadership of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. When you saw President Mugabe, I believe he had on the Peking suit. The reason was because China gave Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF guns. Russia gave ZAPU and Como's group guns. And the Chinese, the Russians used to teach you when they gave you guerrilla training, the outcome of a guerrilla war was determined by the quality of armament. The Chinese said, no, it's the will of the people. Mm-hmm. And when Josiah Tongogara, who led the armed struggle in Zimbabwe, when they went to the Nanking Academy, President Mnangagwa, the current president, also being part of that group that went, the Chinese told them, never carry weapons amongst the people. You will scare them. They'll call the colonial authorities on you. Only use your weapons when you're going to strike the enemy, and that should be done very calculated.
So is it your studied opinion at this time that what the Chinese are doing is helpful?
Like I said, okay, when I told you that earlier, we mentioned that 67% of the agricultural force in Africa, the workforce, is in Southern Africa. In the last 15 years, China has built 20 agricultural demonstration centers all over the African continent, 7 of them in Southern Africa. And the reason they are building them is to show these farmers how to use technology, how to enhance their empowerment. Once they learn the tactics, the Chinese turn over that to them. Every African country that has a nation that has a supercomputer, China put it there. This is the reason why in 2005, I remember Dr. Simbi Mubako, the former Zimbabwean ambassador to the United States, he told me, I had a meeting with him, it was delayed for 3 hours. I said, he said, oh, I'm sorry, comrade. The reason they called me to the State Department. He said when former President Mugabe, on our 25th anniversary, said we're developing a look east policy. They were emergency meetings. We shut the State Department down today. And what ended up happening is all the African nations, and it's not just about China, it's about Vietnam, because Vietnam is the fastest growing economy in the world. So you're talking about the grandchildren of Ho Chi Minh, who taught them that the world won't be free till Africa is free. And Ho Chi Minh telling SNCC when they went to see him, telling Kwame Ture. The reason I love Vietnam so much is because I met a man named the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey in Harlem in the 20s. And when I heard him talk about Africa, I said, I should love Vietnam. And when Ho Chi Minh sat down with the United States government from a position of strength, and he said, you keep trashing us about being communists, you forget it was patriotism, not communism, that initially inspired us. So when Trump talks about nationalism, we got the card on nationalism, all colonized people. But anyway, getting back to the point, our solidarity with Asia is nothing new. We have a relationship with the North Koreans based on this nationalism and self-determination. We have the relationship with Vietnam. The relationship is with Asia, and that is the biggest fear of our former colonizers and captors. When the Obama administration had their meeting with all the African nations 4 years ago to discuss business, the number one objective for them was to get them to abandon China. Even Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, who we mentioned earlier, one of the most reactionary leaders in Africa, the biggest advocate of AFRICOM in Africa, she even had a one China policy when it was all said and done. So China is in Africa on solidarity. There are some contradictions. There may be some isolated incidents that may arouse our concerns, but we will not let the extended mouthpieces of the Corporate Council on Africa, the extended mouthpieces of the Council of Foreign Relations to do anything to trash China. And as we remember, it was in Du Bois went to China and his 91st birthday was made a national holiday. So we're clear on the history, and we know our relationship with Asia and our relationship with the United States and the European Union are diametrically opposite. It's a question of narrative, it's a question of transparency, it's a question of honesty. Let's be honest, please.
Please. The role of, you hear so much about the role of Eritrea.
Eritrea?
Eritrea. In stabilizing Africa's, what is characterized as the most chaotic region. You want to address that?
Oh my goodness, Eritrea? Woo! Imagine this. Now, one of the highlights of our history, as much as we love Dr. Dorothy Height and them beautiful hats, they were not the first women's organization we had. The National Association of Colored Women, 1896, right? So you talking Harriet Tubman, Araminta Ross in her twilight years. You talking Mary Church Terrell. You talking Nannie Helen Burroughs, Ida B. Wells in the same organization? You kidding? What? Imagine this. Imagine a guerrilla struggle in Africa where 33% of the guerrillas are women. Imagine all those women we mentioned in guerrilla uniforms with the fervor they had, with the determination they had. That's what happened in Eritrea. Now you look, Angola fought for 14 years against Portuguese colonialism. Guinea-Bissau around the same. Zimbabwe 14 years against British colonialism, militarily I'm speaking. Algeria 8. Eritrea fought for 30. And remember this now, and this is one of the contradictions. We know that our Rastafarian sisters and brothers, they look at Haile Selassie as a deity figure. But did he or did he not cut a deal with Woodrow Wilson where he would be recognized in U.S. circles as not only the emperor of Ethiopia, but the emperor of what was called Italian Somaliland at the time, and Eritrea? So now you're talking about the dynamic of annexation. And to make that relatable to your audience, think of what U.S. imperialism did with Texas and California, snatching it from Mexico. Think about the fact that the first 7 presidents of the United States seek to annex Cuba. This is what we're speaking of. So the Eritreans had to fight against that. And then now, ever since they've been in power, one of the things we have to talk about, the United States Agency for International Development, a monster.
Okay.
Created.
United States
Agency for International Development.
You call it a monster, why?
Oh, because they is one of the biggest masquerades going, humanitarian imperialism under the guise of humanitarianism. So you do humanitarian aid, but at the same time you're dictating with an iron fist everything that should be done. And 5 years ago in the Americas, I'm so glad you incorporated the Americas into this, truly Pan-African by the way, you had the Bolivarian Alliance of Our Americas say that they must not be welcomed anywhere. Cuba was part of that conversation. Venezuela was part of that conversation. Bolivia was part of that conversation. Suriname was part of that conversation. Nicaragua was part of that conversation. Right around the same time, now this will bring a smile to your face, Putin expels U.S. aid from Russia. But 10 years before that, Eritrea were the first ones to do it. So when the Obama administration had that summit with the African countries, Zimbabwe was not invited, Eritrea was not invited, and Sudan was not invited. So this question of humanitarian aid, and it's part of this whole conversation that's intensifying where we're talking about economics in Africa. But the neo-colonialists that we speak of, they always want to talk about economics in isolation from political climate. And the same way that we have to tell the meteorologists around us, when you talk about climate change for Africans, that includes the social climate. That's the most important climate change of all. We've benefited from that. So from that vantage point, you look at the fact that Ahmed Sekou Touré warned us. He said it is not the adaptation of political action to economic action. On the contrary, it is the use of economic activities for political ends. You look at Southern Africa now. When you're fighting for national liberation, Mr. Newman, you can easily camouflage your class interest. Think of all the Cubans that died in Angola and think of their families. And they look now and they see the daughter of Jose Eduardo dos Santos, the incarnation of Agostinho Neto. His daughter's the first billionaire in Africa. That's what we fought for? Yeah. You look at Ramaphosa in South Africa. He's a billionaire by Western standards. That's what we fought for. This is what undermined what President Mugabe was trying to do in Zimbabwe and made people recognize it was time for him to step aside, because many of the people who were screaming Pamberi Chimurenga the loudest, they were compromising everything that he, Nathan Shamirira, Joseph Masika, Herbert Chitepo, Johanna Nkomo, all these fighters gave their lives for. And this is the reason why we say our struggle is always a nation class struggle, because we want to share the resources of our people. And just to make it plain for folks, as Gil Noble used to say, we're still for socialism.
You know, I titled this show, All Things Africa. And the connection I'm going to make here is that it is a country primarily made up of Africans. I want to talk about Haiti. Because what you talk about in terms of the exploitation of the African continent, it seems to be in Haiti what is an extraordinary microcosm of what has happened on the continent. You want to speak a little bit to Haiti?
Oh man, you set me, you like a point guard today. So, so look, I mean, well, of course, the Haitian Revolution, 1804, it is established we will never allow any conversation about our captivity from Africa to begin in the Americas and not mention Haiti first. That's established. But sometimes when we're talking about Boukman and voodoo, and we're talking about Cecile Fatiman, and of course we should, we forget about the neo-colonialist dynamic in Haiti and what Papa Doc and Baby Doc did to that country in the context of what Trujillo did to the Dominican Republic, in the context of what Pinochet did to Chile, and in the context of and this is why Grenada under Maurice Bishop was so important. So I think that what we see in Haiti is the same thing.
You know, and if I might add again, if somebody's peering in here and is uninitiated, that when you can't talk Papa Doc Chevalier and Baby Doc Chevalier and the Tonton Macoute in Haiti without talking about the inextricable link to the U.S. government.
We were going there. Democrats and Republicans, you're talking about the Monroe Doctrine. And what many people forget, just when you take a look at that aspect of Haiti, you remember Aristide's first press conference? First question asked to him was, you trying to do what they're doing in Cuba? That's the first thing they asked him. Right. And many people forget when you look at the Bay of Pigs invasion and Kennedy goes on record the next year introducing the blockade after the Bay of Pigs invasion fails, what does he say? Cuba's not a threat just because of their ability to maintain their direction, the inspiration they give others to follow the same. So this is why Maurice Bishop and the New Jew movement had to be dealt with. This is the reason why they're going after Venezuela with everything they've got. This is the reason why they're going after Bolivia with everything they've got. Because now you have this African-South American alliance where we're looking at, and remember what is called the pink tide in the Americas, you're seeing the resurgence of socialism in the Americas. FMLN in El Salvador, socialist. Chavez's government, socialist. Cuba, unapologetically socialist. So this is something that's happening, and it's happening at a moment in history where you have, according to Forbes magazine, 2,063 billionaires worth $9 trillion and 1 billion hungry people at the same moment in history, at a time where, back to Mother Africa, 4 children die every hour just from starvation. So what we are speaking of, and this is why when you have people like George Soros, who masquerades as a humanitarian, but is responsible for financing 350 of the 400 civil society groups to bring about regime change in Zimbabwe, we don't care how many organizations in the United States benefit from his pot of gold. We know what his true intentions are, because when the Open Society Initiative started in 1979, their first targets in conjunction with the Vatican were socialism in Czechoslovakia, socialism in Poland. So any of the African organizations still left that are now parties in power that represent that tradition, that represent that pedigree, he considers them sworn enemies to his grave. And that's why we consider him our sworn enemy to our grave. And we're asking all our sisters and brothers that are getting money from him, the list is too long to go over, 206 organizations to be precise, would they be willing to break ties with him until he pulls his money out of regime change in Zimbabwe?
You know, that started out with commentary about Haiti, and it was, you know, it's rather difficult probably to have that conversation without mentioning Cuba as you did.
Of course.
And so what I want to kind of wrap up here, man, we are already getting towards the end of our time. We have a couple of minutes here. Got to get you back one more time.
Yeah, we have fun on here.
That we wrap up. I want to discuss the Cuban Amor Africa, Amor Cuba project.
Will you? Okay, cool.
So we got less than 2 minutes.
Oh man, real quickly.
All right.
17 years ago, when the Millennium Fund was created to deal with HIV/AIDS on the African continent in particular, but throughout the diaspora, the now late UN Secretary General, former Kofi Annan, paid a courtesy call to Comandante Fidel Castro. And it is said that he raised the question, would Cuba contribute monetarily to this fund? Now, him knowing that Cuba has lost over $100 billion because of the monstrous blockade imposed on them, and the ability to still maintain the highest literacy rate in the world, the lowest infant mortality rate in the world, the most advanced gerontology program for your listeners who don't know what we just said, treating the elderly. But for whatever reason, they're still able to maintain this. Comandante Fidel Castro said Dr. King ain't the only one with a dream. His dream is to build a medical school in Africa. And he said, but also, we will deploy, because we believe that the human resource is the most precious of all. We want, if the money is ever available, we want 4,000 Cuban doctors, nurses, specialists, and researchers focusing on HIV/AIDS to be deployed in Africa, and they will remain in Africa until HIV/AIDS has been eradicated. And that's why our second play was called Cuba's Greatest Army, a tribute to the Cuban doctors. So what we're saying is, we want the Cuban we want to create an economic pool to send those Cuban doctors to Africa. We want to create a political undercurrent so that Cuban doctors can come to Native American reservations inside U.S. borders, prison infirmaries inside U.S. borders, and communities that have had hospitals and clinics shut down, which would be a tribute to Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. And then the last part of it, in the name of Samuel Paranyatwa, Zimbabwe's first doctor, who was the #2 man of Nkomo in the first liberation movement, ZAPU, who was to them what Fanon was to Algeria and Augustino Neto was to Algeria, and Che Guevara was to Cuba, medical revolutionaries. We're saying that we want to start sending medical supplies to the Cuban doctors in Zimbabwe.
The clock has stopped us, and we've got to go.
Okay,
Thank
cool.
you so much. Really
Thanks
do want
a
to
lot.
get you back.
Thanks.
Folks, thanks for joining us this evening. For more information about this program and any other program produced by WHUT, go to WHUT.org. Goodbye and God bless.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.